Before dawn on March 21st, 1918, German guns opened. Fresh divisions freed from the Russian front, hammering the British Fifth Army near Saint-Quentin. A shell slammed into the forward trench, throwing a soldier against the chalk wall. He stayed there, breath shaking, until a pair of boots stopped beside him. In the swirling dust, he saw Lieutenant Colonel Wilfrith Elstob, coat scorched, blood seeping through a fresh bandage. Without a word, Elstob hauled him to his feet. The soldier straightened, and others followed. German assault troops were already pushing through the haze. If they broke past Manchester Hill, nothing would slow the drive toward Amiens. Elstob knew the line had to stand. He grabbed a sack of Mills bombs and drew his revolver. A broken line gathered itself around him, finding its footing again. He smiled at his men, quote, "This is battalion headquarters. Here we fight, and here we die." In the summer of 1914, the web of European alliances snapped, and the continent plunged into the abyss of the Great War. Men who could not be more removed from warfare, like Wilfrith Elstob, whose world revolved around old books and the nuances of French grammar, suddenly saw the call of duty drowning out all their academic ambitions. The abstract concepts of honor, king, and country suddenly became too real. In September, just weeks after Britain declared war on Germany, the schoolmaster walked away from his classroom and enlisted as an ordinary private in a public schools battalion. These units were filled with educated volunteers, men who could have applied for non-combatant roles but chose to serve in the infantry. Elstob's intellect and natural bearing were immediately apparent, as was his fluent French, a skill he gained after spending a year in Beauvais, France, as a student and teacher. The army had little need for a private with literary debate skills, but a clever leader capable of coordinating with French allies was invaluable. He was quickly offered a commission and the chance to become an officer in the Manchester Regiment's 16th Service Battalion. It was a PALS battalion, a unit composed almost entirely of men from Manchester's business district, clerks and warehousemen who had traded their business lives for Lee-Enfield rifles, joining up together to serve alongside their friends and colleagues. A close university friend, Hubert Worthington, had already joined and urged him to accept. Elstob agreed, trading his academic gown for an officer's tunic and taking command of a platoon in A Company. After months of grueling training across England, a period highlighted by a grand parade before the legendary Lord Kitchener in Manchester's Albert Square, Second Lieutenant Elstob, now almost in his 30s, and his comrades finally deployed to the Western Front in November 1915. The scholar had become a soldier. The Western Front was a meat grinder, but where some men emerged broken, Wilfrith Elstob forged a quiet authority and fearlessness that propelled him through the ranks. He was not especially ambitious or ruthless. However, he displayed an unwavering performance under the most extreme pressure. July 1st, 1916, was the catastrophic first day of the Battle of the Somme. As his company advanced toward the fortified German lines near Montauban, the air was torn apart by the mechanical chatter of machine guns. Elstob was struck in the neck. The round tore through flesh and muscle. As blood streamed down his tunic, a sergeant scrambled to his side and applied a field dressing, urging him to go to the rear. Elstob refused, ignoring the pain and the very real danger of bleeding out. He remained on his feet, continuing to direct his platoon's assault. His voice remained loud and clear. This act of sheer grit and selfless leadership went unnoticed no longer. It earned him the Military Cross. Just over a week later, the battalion marched into Tron Wood, a tangled wreck of shattered trees and shell holes, where fighting was savage and often hand-to-hand. There, Elstob was wounded for a second time. By now, the officer corps of the 16th Manchesters had been gutted. The relentless attrition of the Somme had claimed so many of his superiors that Elstob, less than 2 years into his military career, was promoted to be the battalion's second-in-command. The responsibility was immense, but he shouldered it without complaint. A few months later, when the battalion's commanding officer was lost in action, Elstob was made acting lieutenant colonel, taking full command of the unit. It was an extraordinary burden for one so young, yet his men were not surprised. They knew him to be, quote, fearless, enthusiastic, determined, and above all, just. Throughout the relentless campaigns of 1917, Lieutenant Colonel Wilfrith Elstob commanded the 16th Battalion, the Manchester Regiment, through two of the most harrowing battles of the Western Front. In April, during the Battle of Arras, the battalion helped push into the German lines east of Arras, following weeks of bombardment that dropped more than 2.5 million shells. Advancement came quickly, but soon the offensive bogged down into a costly stalemate, with British forces suffering around 160,000 casualties. Elstob's men operated amid shattered terrain, captured German trenches, and constant countershelling that turned every advance into a brutal ordeal. Later that summer and autumn, his command endured the infamous Third Battle at Ypres, more commonly known as Passchendaele. Torrential rain, combined with constant artillery fire, turned the front into a waterlogged quagmire. His leadership was recognized with the award of the Distinguished Service Order in January 1918 for his conduct during these campaigns. He even took temporary command of the entire 90th Brigade. Yet the relentless stress, the loss of comrades, and the nightmarish conditions left their mark on him and his men. His crushed spirit was evident in his writing, quote, "Terribly lonely, and that my work is not as good as it was. Sometimes my heart aches for a friend to go and unburden myself to." Despite this inner turmoil, he remained the bedrock of his battalion, an officer, quote, "loved alike by officers and men." By March 1918, a palpable sense of dread hung over the British lines. For months, intelligence had pointed to a massive, impending German offensive. The collapse of Russia on the Eastern Front had freed up hundreds of thousands of veteran German soldiers who were now massing in the West for a final war-winning blow, codenamed Operation Michael. The storm was expected to break in the sector held by General Gau's thinly stretched Fifth Army near Saint-Quentin. It was into this powder keg that the 16th Manchester were moved. As part of the 30th Division, their task was to garrison a key forward position known as Manchester Hill, a modest rise of ground near the shattered village of Francilly-Salancy that had been transformed into a fortified redoubt. On March 18th, Lieutenant Colonel Elstob led his men into the position, relieving the unit that had held it previously. He understood the importance of this place the second he saw the map. It was the designated breaking point, the place the German hammer was expected to fall first and hardest. Manchester Hill was a series of interconnected trenches, machine gun posts, and dugouts, centered on an old quarry on its reverse slope. It was an island of defense, in a wider, more fluid system of strongpoints. Elstob knew that if the German attack came as expected, his battalion would likely be cut off, surrounded, and forced to fight on its own. He wasted no time in preparing his men for the ordeal to come. He gathered his officers and NCOs, his face grim in the pale spring light. He explained the strategic situation with stark clarity. They were to expect a bombardment of unprecedented intensity, followed by an overwhelming infantry assault. They might have to fight for days without hope of reinforcement or relief. Their orders were absolute. They were to hold their ground to the last man. To underscore the finality of these orders, Elstob pointed toward the main command dugout, a deep shelter burrowed into the chalk of the quarry, quote, "This is battalion headquarters. Here we fight, and here we die." Captain Bernard Bunny Dean, one of the officers present, would later recall the chilling certainty of that moment, quote, "We knew the old man meant it. There would be no surrender." A grim, silent understanding passed through the assembled men. They were the bulwark. They were the forlorn hope, and their commander would be with them until the bitter end. In the final days of peace, an eerie calm settled over Manchester Hill. Elstob used every available moment to strengthen his position. He structured his defense with meticulous care. A Company, under Captain C.H. Ashe, held the right flank of the hill's forward slope, reinforced by 2 platoons from C Company. The left flank was the responsibility of Captain G.E.M. Guest's B Company, bolstered by 2 platoons from D Company. Elstob placed his own command post at the heart of the position. In the quarry near a sunken road, a critical nerve center from which he could control the entire fight. Under the cloak of darkness, on the nights of March 19th and 20th, he walked the lines personally. He was a solid, reassuring presence, his stocky frame moving defiantly through the winding trenches. He checked the sighting of every Lewis gun, ensuring they had overlapping fields of fire. He quizzed sergeants on the distribution of ammunition and made sure boxes of Mel's bomb grenades were placed in every fire bay. He paused to share a quiet word with the sentries, peering into the blackness of no man's land, his calm demeanor a potent antidote to their mounting anxiety. He urged tired men to keep digging, to deepen the trenches, to reinforce the parapets. The men of the 16th Manchester adored their commander. Many were the original PALs from Manchester who had joined in 1914 and served with him through the horrors of the Somme and Passchendaele. They had seen his courage firsthand. They knew his record, the military cross, the distinguished service order, the multiple wounds he had shrugged off to stay in the fight. More than that, they knew he cared for them. He'd shared the lice-infested dugouts, the inadequate uniforms, even the freezing winter rations. He knew their names, and they knew he would never ask them to face a danger he would not face himself. If the colonel was here walking the line, then everything would be all right. On the night of March 20th, the signs of the approaching attack could no longer be denied. German artillery batteries rumbled into new positions, and the hum of enemy aircraft grew louder every day. The tension was a physical thing, and not in the stomach of every soldier. Retreating to his dugout, Elstob took out a pen and paper to write one last letter to a friend. If he were to fall on the battlefield, he asked, quote, "Do not grieve for me, for it is with the 16th that I would gladly lay down my life." At 4:40 a.m. on March 21st, 1918, the world was ripped apart. Along a 40-mile front, over 6,500 German cannons and 3,500 mortars fired at once in an unprecedented cataclysmic bombardment. It was the Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's battle. On Manchester Hill, the barrage was a hurricane of fire and steel. It began with a sinister hissing as thousands of gas shells, a cocktail of phosgene and tear gas, arced over no man's land, releasing their choking clouds into the British trenches. Men scrambled for the respirators, the world reduced to the muffled rasp of their own breathing and the distorted view through fogged eyepieces. Then came the high explosives. Shells of every caliber rained down in a relentless torrent, turning the carefully constructed defenses into a churning landscape of smoke, mud, and flying shrapnel. The ground convulsed, trenches collapsed, and the air filled with the screams of the wounded and the sickening stench of cordite. While his men huddled in whatever corner they could find, Elstob moved between the posts, seemingly oblivious to the maelstrom around him. The official citation for his Victoria Cross would later note, quote, "During the preliminary bombardment, he encouraged his men in the posts in the redoubt by frequent visits." The bombardment was methodical. It systematically targeted command posts, communication lines, and artillery positions. Within the first hour, every telephone wire connecting Manchester Hill to brigade headquarters had been severed. They were deaf, dumb, and utterly alone. By 7 a.m., the bombardment reached a new crescendo. A thick, unnatural fog, mingled with the chemical fumes and shell smoke, blanketed the entire battlefield, reducing visibility to a few yards. The men of the 16th Manchester could only wait, their knuckles white as they gripped their rifles, their ears ringing from the concussions, their senses overwhelmed. They peered into the swirling gray mist, listening for any sound beyond the shelling that might signal the approach of the enemy. The inevitable infantry assault was coming. It was only a matter of time. Around 8:30 a.m., the character of the noise changed. The rhythm of the German bombardment shifted, lifting from the frontline trenches to create a creeping curtain of fire farther to the rear. Through the dense fog and smoke, spectral figures began to emerge. They were the German stormtroopers, elite assault troops who had crawled across no man's land under the cover of the barrage. They appeared with terrifying suddenness, swarming over the shattered barbed wire and dropping into the British trenches before many of the day's defenders could even react. On the right and left flanks of Manchester Hill, the forward platoons of Captains Ashe and Guest were hit by the full force of the attack. Vicious close-quarters fighting erupted in the narrow confines of the trenches. The rattle of Lewis guns mixed with the sharp crack of rifles, the thud of exploding grenades, and the desperate shouts of men engaged in brutal combat. The Manchesters fought back furiously, pouring fire into the gray-clad figures that materialized out of the murk, but they were horrifically outnumbered. The German 50th Reserve Division, spearheaded by specially trained assault battalions, was converging on their position. The British defensive strategy relied on holding isolated strongpoints, but the fog allowed the stormtroopers to bypass these islands of resistance, infiltrating the gaps between them and surrounding each position. Within minutes, the forward companies on Manchester Hill were cut off from each other and from the rest of the British line. By 9 a.m., as the fog began to thin, the dire situation became brutally clear. The Manchesters were fighting in besieged pockets, surrounded by a sea of German infantry. From his central command post in the quarry, Elstob grasped the unfolding disaster instantly. With his telephone lines gone, he relied on the bravery of his runners, who dashed through a hail of bullets and shrapnel to carry his orders. He knew that if his men remained in their fragmented positions, they would be destroyed piecemeal. Even before the fog had fully lifted, he had anticipated the encirclement and made a critical, fateful decision. He ordered the survivors of the forward companies to fight their way back to the battalion's core defensive position around the quarry. At approximately 7:30 a.m., he had already moved his command post to the very heart of the redoubt, preparing for an all-around defense. Now, he fought to consolidate his remaining forces into one defiant bastion. Remnants of the shattered platoons fell back, joining him in a shrinking perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Elstob was no longer defending a line. He was commanding an island, a tiny piece of England in a tide of grey. The fighting on Manchester Hill through the morning devolved into a primal struggle for survival. It was a chaotic series of desperate, disconnected skirmishes fought with bayonets in trench bays and grenades tossed into packed dugouts. Elstob was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of defiant energy. He was not a commander directing a battle from the safety of a bunker. He was a warrior in the thick of the fight. The citation for his Victoria Cross recounts how, when a German bombing party threatened to overwhelm one of the defensive posts, Elstob, quote, single-handedly repulsed one bombing assault, driving back the enemy and inflicting severe casualties. The colonel grabbed a sack of Mills bombs and his service revolver, vaulted onto the trench parapet, and charged directly at the advancing German grenade squad. Firing his revolver point-blank and hurling bombs, he broke their attack and sent the survivors reeling back in disarray. A private who witnessed the action saw Elstob return, his jacket singed and his revolver still smoking, and heard him announce grimly, quote, "There's one less bunch of Fritz we'll have to deal with." By late morning, Elstob had been wounded twice, once by shrapnel and again by a bullet that grazed his heart. Blood stained his uniform, but he contemptuously waved away any attempts to treat his injuries. A runner who saw him around 11 a.m. described the colonel's left arm as being soaked in blood and a crude bandage wrapped around his heart, yet he was still on his feet, shouting orders and encouragement. One of the men later wrote, quote, "His voice was as steady as if on parade." No one who saw their commander's fearless disregard for his own life could bring themselves to give up. Shortly before noon, the last of the fog burned away, revealing a terrifying panorama. The British front had collapsed. German troops were swarming across the landscape on all sides, their victory all but complete. Manchester Hill was utterly alone, a tiny, defiant rock against which the German tide was crashing. Ammunition was running perilously low after hours of continuous fighting. Elstob himself made several terrifying dashes into the open, under withering sniper and machine gun fire, to scavenge cartridges and Lewis gun drums from the bodies of the fallen, dragging the precious supplies back to his men. One soldier, Private Harold Chapman, saw a shell explode near the colonel, blowing him off his feet. Elstob simply picked himself up, brushed the chalk dust from his coat, and laughed. By early afternoon, with his garrison shrinking and the enemy closing in from all directions, Elstob managed to get one last clear message out on a buried telephone line that had miraculously survived. His words to Brigade HQ were a simple, defiant epitaph for his command, quote, "The Manchester Regiment will defend Manchester Hill to the last." With the last message sent, the final telephone line went cold. The handful of survivors on Manchester Hill were now completely cut off from the world, their fates sealed. Elstob gathered his remaining officers and NCOs in the quarry. According to Company Sergeant Major Cyril Lawrence, the colonel's face was a mask of grim resolve, pale from blood loss, but his eyes blazing. His voice was quiet but firm, quote, "Men, we have obeyed our orders and held this position. Now our duty is to fight to the end. No surrender." He looked at each man in turn, repeating the vow he had made days earlier, a vow that was now a statement of imminent fact, quote, "Here we fight, and here we die." Moments later, the final German assault began. Fresh stormtroopers, supported by field guns that had been dragged forward to fire over open sights, stormed the quarry. The last defenders, no more than a few dozen men, met them with a desperate volley of fire. Elstob stood on the rim of the quarry, firing his revolver down at the attackers until a shell blast threw him violently through the air. Incredibly, he pulled himself to his feet again, drawing a ragged cheer from his men. By 3 p.m., the defense had disintegrated into a series of individual last stands in shell holes and corners of the quarry. The Manchesters, their ammunition all but gone, fought back-to-back with bayonets and clubbed rifles. Elstob, wounded a third time and barely able to stand, continued to fire his revolver and yell encouragement, quote, "Do not lose heart. Fight on." At approximately 3:30 p.m., the Germans finally overwhelmed the last pocket of resistance. Seeing the incredible bravery of the few remaining defenders, a German officer called for them to surrender. The firing ceased for a moment. All eyes turned to the blood-soaked English colonel. The Germans shouted again for them to give up. Elstob, using his last ounce of strength, stood up tall, making himself a clear target. In a loud, clear voice that echoed across the ruined hill, he gave his one-word reply, quote, "Never." A volley of German rifles answered him. Lieutenant Colonel Wilfrith Elstob fell instantly, true to his word to the very last second. His body was never found. It was lost to the churned earth of the battlefield he'd so heroically defended. Of the 168 men who had garrisoned the hill, only 17 eventually made it back to British lines.